heading up a group called the Connected Information Innovation Center. We think a lot about the techie side of some of the questions that have been discussed today. What happens when large pools of information get connected together? How can you take advantage of that, and how can you make new things emerge out of that soup, if you will, that primordial soup? It was sort of fortuitous timing that I was asked to give a talk today about distributed knowledge. I'd actually been struggling with some of those questions just at that time. I have a 5-year-old daughter, and we were reading a book. I don't know if you guys are familiar with it. Mole Music. Does anybody know this one? It's a delightful children's book. We were sitting outside on a beautiful day reading this book, and after the book was over, after we'd finished reading the book, she said to me, "Daddy, do moles sleep during the day or at nighttime?" It had nothing to do with the book, right? And I have training in biology, but frankly, I was stumped on this one. My first thought was that they were nocturnal, but it didn't make a lot of sense. They're underground. I just didn't know. And I said, "Hang on a second, honey. Let me look it up on my iPhone." Right? Pulled out the iPhone, poked around, and in under a minute or two, I found out that moles actually sleep 4 hours and work 4 hours, and sleep 4 hours. So it's sort of like the college students of the underground, you know. But I also found out a bunch of other cool things about moles. For example, they eat worms, and their saliva has a neurotoxin in it. They paralyze the worms to keep them alive and fresh and stash them in their tunnels. And they can eat them later when the supply might not be so good. And before they eat them, they actually squeeze them between their hands and squeeze out all the poop. Okay? And so I explained all this stuff to my daughter.
And she didn't say TMI?
She was thrilled. She was loving it. She was loving this whole thing. And then she said to me, "Daddy, how come your iPhone knows everything?" And yeah, exactly. And it's you sort of hope that your kid thinks you know everything, right? But in fact, it was my iPhone. I'd been displaced. So this kind of threw me spinning about what does it mean, what is knowledge, and how does it fit? And I started reading some of the philosophers. And from a technologist's standpoint, dealing with large pools of data, the philosophers weren't that helpful. I couldn't quite ground it and apply it as well as I might have hoped. Although thinking about it more, I sort of came back to some similar conclusions. But in terms of the path, they didn't lead me where I wanted to go. So I started thinking, what's the difference between my iPhone and, say, the library, right? You wouldn't say the library knows everything, but you might say that your iPhone knows everything, or at least my daughter would. So what is it about libraries that's different from the web, which is, of course, how I use the iPhone? And I started thinking about a continuum between a large data collection and a knowledge system, which is, again, my daughter's perception of my iPhone, and in large part what we're trying to build at Fujitsu Labs, or one of the things we're trying to build. And I realized, as I was trying to build, among other things, a taxonomy of distributed knowledge systems and distributed knowledge models and modes and stuff, I couldn't build a taxonomy. I found that it had to be a continuum between these two extremes. And in this talk today, I'm hoping to slot a bunch of examples in along this continuum and see what some of the principles are that define it. So at one end of the spectrum is the Web 1.0 sort of corporate presence sites, right? It's a collection of data, and that's about it. At the other end of the spectrum is this notion of emergent intelligence, emergent properties, intelligent behavior. Some say marketplaces can be extremely intelligent in the way they act, at least much of the time. My favorite example of emergent intelligence is schools of fish, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. But before I talk about fish schooling, I want to note that at that left edge, that data collection edge, these things exhibit centralized control, right? Nobody can edit, the corporate website. It's a non-collaborative model. It's not responsive in the way that a school of fish is, for example. And it's unconnected. It's kind of its own little insular universe. At the other end, of course, think school of fish, right? Decentralized, collaborative, responsive, and connected. Okay. So schools of fish. The way schools of fish work, each fish feels the fish near it and knows where they are and tries to stay near the fish around it. But if it sees something really interesting, it tends to want to go towards that interesting thing or away from some scary or horrible thing. And depending upon how interesting the good thing is and how much all the other fish are pulling the other way, if it sees something that's really interesting and it pulls hard enough, then boom, it becomes the leader and all the other fish follow it. So this very simple set of rules leads to this kind of rapid switching, dynamic, intelligent, adaptive, decentralized behavior that schools of fish exhibit. Really quite amazing. Konrad Lorenz describes in his book On Aggression from way back when that people had done experiments where they could, this is a digression, by the way, I should flag digression here. Konrad Lorenz notes that there have been experiments where they can take fish and desensitize them to the fish around them. They just damage their brains a little bit in a certain way, and the fish don't know what the other fish are doing. And that fish becomes the leader. Right? Wow. Yeah, that's what happened, exactly. I'm not saying anything. But it's sort of fascinating, and it does explain historically kind of the sociopathic leadership. But it also explains that a system can be built that can be adaptive and responsive and collaborative, but it can also be brittle. And that's a sensitivity that needs to be addressed in system design. Anyhow, let's go to the next step up, which is along the continuum, which is where there are multiple independent sources of information feeding in. Collected information is sort of the next one up in the line. And think about, imagine Flickr or YouTube without the ratings. Okay, just sort of as a thought experiment, right? Lots of disparate people throwing their stuff in. These things aren't really interacting much with each other, but they're just kind of piling up in a single location. Okay, and there are lots of sites like that, but the best known would be Flickr and YouTube, again, minus the ratings as a thought experiment. One notch up from that is taking disparate information from separate sources that aren't collaborating with each other and putting them together. These are mashups, right? We've all heard this term ad nauseum. I cite two here, housingmaps.com and chicagocrime.org. And if anybody wants my slides, I'll be happy to email them to you. So don't worry about copying anything down. I have a quick demo of housingmaps.com. I'll go through it fast. So housingmaps.com is a combination of Craigslist and Google Maps. Craigslist, as you probably know, is sort of the giant want advertiser of everything. People throw all this stuff up there. So this guy took, it was very clever, all the ads for properties for rent and put them right on top of Google Maps. So now you can look in the neighborhood you want and see what's available. And you can look by city or by price. If I go to price, you can do the drop down. Click on that, and you see the items change. And then you can roll over an item, see the listing. By the way, this is not actually live on the web. These are all screen caps. Click on the entry there and then see the listing. So what's interesting is that map, which I will back up to, is a lot more informative in some ways than the listing itself. And you probably can't read the very light gray letters. Here it says, powered by Craigslist and Google Maps. Below that, almost illegibly, it says, this site is in no way affiliated with Craigslist or Google. Okay, and to me, that should be in big letters, right? Because that's the coolest thing in the world. The fact that they can do something so interesting and so powerful without any affiliation with these other guys, just pulling the data in and mixing it in a smart way. So that puts housingmaps.com sort of the next spot. One up from that is multiple collaborating sources, and I would say massive collaboration. Wikipedia has already been discussed. I'll talk about it briefly a little bit more, and of course Linux, right? So Eric Raymond, one of the gurus of open source, has said, given enough eyeballs, every bug is shallow, right? There's someone out there, somewhere, there's enough people looking, who knows the answer to this any given problem. And it's that large number of eyeballs that make these things possible. So let's look at Wikipedia again. Of course, here's the article on moles. And it's a fairly short article. It's about 1,000 words long, 980 something. And what struck me about it is when I went to the history page, which shows a list of all the revisions. And this is the first 500 revisions to this article. Okay, there's actually something like a second 500 revisions. And someone asked the question earlier, why is Wikipedia so good? The reason it's so good is because of what Eric Raymond said, right? There's enough eyeballs looking at this and enough revisions happening. 500 revisions, 1,000 revisions on an article about moles? It's only a 1,000-word article. So that's part of the power. When you go back and look at the very first iteration of the article on moles, it is not 1,000 words long, it's 42 words long. So you can see how this grows and develops. And this elucidates an important point. The scale of the collaboration, which could only happen with openness. I mean, J.K. Rowling doesn't have 500 editors, right? So the scale of openness is what enables the quality to be there, and that's the crucial point. So next up in this continuum, at least in my worldview, is large-scale real-time collaboration, right? And I consider the virtual worlds an example of that. Second Life, World of Warcraft. So in the spirit of showing brief examples, I can't demonstrate what Second Life is right now. So if you guys don't know, you'll have to take my word for it. But what I can hopefully demonstrate is to provide a sense of scale of Second Life. So this is, someone online did the Eames Powers of 10 movie, but for Second Life. So this is at the scale of a centimeter, and this is now behind someone at the scale of a meter. And we just sort of keep zooming back, and 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 zooming back. All these little dots are islands, by the way, and zooming back. So that's all the way out. So that should just give you some small sense of scale here. I'll zoom back in again. Oops, no, I won't. This is an older version. So back up. I just checked the numbers recently. There are 12 million registered users in Second Life. In the last week, there were 488,000, roughly 500,000 people in world in the last week. World of Warcraft, where people have to pay about $15 a month to be in the virtual world, there are around 10 million users last count. So there's a lot of people. It's like a big city. Okay, thank you. So there's a lot of people in these worlds, and that large scale is what enables the collaboration to take place. Finally, knowledge extraction. And I list here Google and something we're doing at Fujitsu Labs called sentiment analysis. What Google did, their genius in my view, was actually three things. Before Google, the best search engine, the canonical search engine, was AltaVista. And what AltaVista did is they looked at the content of any given web page, statistically understood the words in it, and said the merit, the quality, the goodness of a web page is based upon an objective analysis of its content and how well it matches a search query. The Google guys said, no, that's not it. Quality of pages is a subjective judgment, and subjective judgments are statistically valid. Subjectivity is valid. That's a huge statement. Right? That's this post-Enlightenment notion of validating the subjective. That's the shocker. It's not that they could look at the link structure, which was their third insight, to extract that knowledge. It was that you could shake loose the shackles, if you will, of this dedication to objectivity and look at a collective subjectivity, mathematically derive it and apply it. So that's why they're billionaires. The other one is sentiment analysis. This is something we're doing at the lab, and I'll show it to you very briefly. This is looking at, you think about blogs comment on web pages typically. If you can look at all the blogs, and I mean all of like millions and millions of blogs, and extract from them the positive or negative sentiment, doing statistical analysis of the sentences. Are people saying good things or bad things about your product? Okay, right? This is that next level up. So here is a bunch of charts and graphs talking about what people had to say about Pepsi-Cola versus some other soft drinks. This is over the time period right after the Super Bowl. So you can see a spike in commentary, both positive and negative, and so on. So finally, moving towards knowledge systems, again, looking at the principles I elucidated before, all the things on the left, centralized control. As you move further and further to the right, the knowledge extraction, the sentiment analysis, what Google is doing is decentralized. It's all those web links. It's highly collaborative. Anybody who links a page on the web is doing something. And I'll just go 30 seconds more. Highly responsive, right? Anything changes out there and boom, it shows up. And it's highly interconnected, which is what enables all these properties to emerge. So for you guys in the philanthropy world, I looked up UNESCO's project outline, how a project's structured. Identification, preparation, blah, blah, blah. There's a million of these different ways of categorizing it. But the fact of the matter is, at every stage here, there's considerable distributed knowledge, collective wisdom that can be leveraged by being open. Right? And that's the crucial thing. During product identification, open it up. Preparation, open it up. Implementation phase, maintenance, evaluation, open it all up. And if you think about the principles I elucidated in every one of these stages of any project organization system, they can benefit and extract that collective knowledge by getting very large numbers of people, not just a few dozens. So with that, thank you very much. Wow.
questions?
I guess it was all clear.
I'm not exactly sure. I thought that was just fascinating. I'm not exactly sure what to do with this question, so I will just turn it into a statement, which is that I am fascinated by the paradox of using the tools of Enlightenment rationality to undermine Enlightenment rationality. And the most riveting phrase that you used was, this is a post-Enlightenment project, which is moving in the direction of appreciating that micro expressions of irrationality in sufficiently large numbers turn into macro expressions of rationality. So it's, in a sense, it's a market mechanism of ideas or of knowledge.
Absolutely. And for markets to work, of course, you need that rapid feedback. But sort of backwinding just a tad, I think that the philosophes, right, the dudes who made the Enlightenment happen, were in a very difficult time, and the pendulum swung a little too far. And it's taken us a couple hundred years, I think, to start swinging the other way.
Susan? Thank you, Francis.
My question, is this even working? Okay, so my question is, the continuum that you showed, it was the evolution, with the idea that as you move further along and get more and more open, that's going to be the wave of the future, and that's going to be kind of the better way to be. But I'm actually, I might be totally wrong because I came in halfway. I'm wondering, are there pieces where it's appropriate to be at other parts of the continuum along the way for the arts?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there certainly are. So, two parts there. The first question is this a conceptual evolution or a temporal evolution, right? I think it's probably both, but things don't. It was Paul Safa who said that the future is already here, it's just not uniformly distributed, right? So Google is a lot older than some of the other things that are to the left of it in this diagram, but they were ahead of the curve. So from a planning perspective inside Fujitsu, we can say, gee, how can we move further to the right? What technologies will be in demand further to the right? So in that sense, we're looking at it temporally. So we can sort of think of it kind of as a loose temporal model. In terms of where it makes sense to put things, there's so many different projects, it's hard to say in anything in absolute terms, but you can speak to the trends. And I think for philanthropists, if you want to get the most bang for your buck, then it makes sense to leverage that collective. And hence, I'd argue, spend your money further to the right.
Dave, thank you so much.
Oh, thanks very much, guys.